October 1st, 1750. In Framingham, Massachusetts, a child is born into slavery. His name is Peter, and the man who owns him will name him Salem after his own hometown. 25 years later, that enslaved child will stand on a blood-soaked hill outside Boston with a musket in his hands, facing down the most powerful military force on earth. Peter Salem's story begins like so many other stories of enslaved people in colonial Massachusetts. He was born to an enslaved mother in Framingham, a farming community about 20 miles west of Boston. His first owner was Jeremiah Belknap, an army captain who ran a farm that relied on the labor of people held in bondage. In 1760, when Peter was just 10 years old, Belknap had him admitted to the church under the halfway covenant, a practice that allowed the children of church members to participate in some aspects of religious life. At that time, there were only 7 people listed as servants for life in Framingham. Peter Salem was one of them. Massachusetts had a complicated relationship with slavery. Unlike the massive plantation systems of the South, slavery in New England operated on a smaller scale, with enslaved people working on farms, in households, and in trades. But make no mistake, it was still slavery. People were still property. Families were still separated. Freedom was still denied. And the laws were clear. Since 1656, both North and South, African Americans had been barred from serving in militias because colonial authorities feared slave insurrections. If you were black, you could not bear arms. If you were enslaved, you had no rights that any white person was bound to respect. The story of slavery in Massachusetts goes back to the very beginning of European settlement. The first enslaved people in Massachusetts arrived shortly after the Pequot War of 1637. The colony legalized slavery in 1641 through its Body of Liberties, which stated there shall never be any bond slavery among us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. It was a carefully worded loophole that allowed colonists to continue the practice while maintaining the fiction that Massachusetts was different from other slaveholding regions. By the time Peter Salem was born in 1750, slavery was deeply embedded in Massachusetts society. Boston had nearly 1,000 enslaved people in 1755. Salem had 83. Cambridge had 56. These numbers might seem small compared to the South, but they represented a significant portion of the population. In Framingham and other farming communities west of Boston, enslaved people tilled the soil, served in kitchens, and worked in homes. They were property, listed in tax assessments alongside horses and livestock. Their labor made these communities possible. Most enslaved people in Massachusetts didn't work on large plantations. They lived alone or with 1 or 2 others, often inside the homes of their owners. They worked as domestic servants, farmhands, or artisans. Some, like Peter Salem's mother, spent their entire lives in bondage in the same town where they were born. The isolation made resistance harder. Unlike in the South, where large populations of enslaved people could communicate and organize, enslaved people in Massachusetts were scattered, separated, atomized. The law treated them as both property and persons, which created a strange legal status. They could be bought and sold like livestock, but they could also sue in court under certain circumstances. The courts mostly sided with owners, but the dual status would eventually become important in the legal battles that would chip away at slavery in Massachusetts after the Revolution. Peter Salem spent the first 25 years of his life as property, working Belknap's farm. likely alongside his mother who was also enslaved there. We don't know if he had siblings. We don't know if his family stayed together. The historical record is silent on these details, as it so often is when it comes to the inner lives of enslaved people. What we do know is that in early 1775, as tensions between the American colonies and Great Britain reached a breaking point, Jeremiah Belknap sold Peter Salem to another man. That man was Major Lawson Buckminster. Buckminster owned a sawmill in Framingham and served as a military officer in the local militia. He was about to become commander of the Framingham Minutemen, volunteers who were ready to fight at a moment's notice. And Buckminster needed men. The Massachusetts Committee of Safety, responding to the growing threat of British military action, had begun recruiting soldiers. But they had a problem. The old laws prohibited enslaved people from serving. The solution was cynical but effective. Masters could free their slaves temporarily so they could enlist, then essentially re-enslave them after the war. It was exploitation dressed up as patriotism. But for Peter Salem, it was also an opportunity. Buckminster emancipated him so he could join the Framingham Minutemen. On April 19, 1775, that decision would place Salem at the very beginning of the American Revolution. The day started before dawn. British troops were marching from Boston toward Concord, sent by General Thomas Gage to seize colonial military supplies. Paul Revere and other riders had spread the alarm through the countryside. The British are coming. The Minutemen were mobilizing. Peter Salem marched with Captain Simon Adgel's company from Framingham to meet the threat. He served for 4 days in that initial action, participating in the battles of Lexington and Concord that ignited the Revolutionary War. Salem was there when the shot heard round the world was fired. He was there when colonial farmers and craftsmen and laborers stood up to professional British soldiers. He was there at the beginning. 5 days later, on April 24th, Salem transferred to Captain Thomas Drury's company, part of Colonel John Nixon's 6th Massachusetts Regiment. This wasn't just any company. Among Salem's fellow soldiers were other African-American Minutemen: Titus Coburn, Salem Poor, and Seymour Burr. All of them would soon fight together in the first major battle of the war. The British Army was bottled up in Boston, surrounded by colonial militia. But they still controlled the city, and they were looking for a way to break out. The key was the high ground. On the night of June 16, 1775, American forces moved onto the Charlestown Peninsula and began building fortifications. They were supposed to fortify Bunker Hill, the highest point, but in the darkness and confusion, they ended up on Breed's Hill instead, closer to the city. By morning, when the British spotted what the Americans had done, it was too late. The colonists had built a redoubt and were dug in. The British response was swift and brutal. They would attack head-on and drive the rebels from the hill. It was a decision born of arrogance and contempt. British officers didn't believe that colonial militia could stand against regular troops in a pitched battle. They were about to learn otherwise. On June 17th, Major John Pitcairn prepared to lead his Marines into battle. Pitcairn was a Scottish officer, 52 years old, who had been in the Marines since he was 23. He'd served in the French and Indian War and had been stationed in Boston since 1774, commanding 600 Marines. The citizens of Boston actually liked Pitcairn. Unlike many British officers, he was seen as reasonable, even-tempered, someone who tried to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. He had been billeted with Francis Shaw, an ardent patriot and neighbor of Paul Revere. Despite their political differences, Shaw observed Pitcairn's pleasant demeanor and fairness. Pitcairn had even saved Shaw's son from a duel. In Shaw's house, Pitcairn hosted gatherings between British officers and patriots, allowing civil discussion of their differences. He attended services at the Old North Church, and was known as a holy-tongued man on Sundays who could swear like the devil Mondays through Saturdays. Pitcairn had led the advance guard at Lexington and Concord back in April, and colonial propagandists had blamed him for ordering his men to fire on the peaceful militia. Modern historians don't believe that. They think Pitcairn actually shouted something like, "Lay down your arms, you villains, and disperse." But in the chaos of that morning, shots were fired, and Pitcairn became notorious among New Englanders as the man who started it all. His horse had been shot from under him during the retreat from Concord, and he'd lost a pair of matched silver pistols when the column's baggage train was abandoned. Those pistols were captured by the Americans. They were eventually offered to George Washington, who declined the gift, and they ended up carried by General Israel Putnam for the rest of the war. Now, 2 months later, Pitcairn was about to lead his Marines up Breed's Hill. The British plan was straightforward. Land troops on the Charlestown Peninsula, march them up the hill, and overwhelm the American position with superior numbers and training. The first assault began in the afternoon. The Americans held their fire until the British were close, then unleashed devastating volleys. The redcoats broke and retreated down the hill. The British regrouped and attacked again. Again, the Americans drove them back with concentrated musket fire. British casualties were mounting. Officers were falling. The Marines were taking horrific losses. Peter Salem was in the redoubt on Breed's Hill. He was positioned with Nixon's regiment, one of about 1,500 Americans defending the position. The day was hot. The smoke from musket fire hung thick in the air. The noise was deafening. The British kept coming. This was Peter Salem's first major battle, and he was facing the most elite troops Britain had to offer. Around him stood other black soldiers, men like Salem Poor, who would distinguish himself so remarkably that 13 officers would later petition the Massachusetts legislature, praising him as a brave and gallant soldier who deserved reward. Whatever Poor did that day was extraordinary enough that white gentlemen in 1775 felt compelled to write it down. The British launched a third assault. This time they came with fixed bayonets, determined to take the hill no matter the cost. The Americans were running out of ammunition. The famous order, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," was as much about conserving powder as it was about marksmanship. The British infantry pushed forward. Behind them came the Marines, led by Major Pitcairn himself. Pitcairn had already been wounded twice, hit by musket balls as he led his men up the hill. But he pressed on, raising his sword and shouting for the glory of the Marines, leading the charge toward the American fortifications. What happened next has been debated by historians for nearly 2.5 centuries. According to multiple American accounts, as the British reached the top of the redoubt, Major Pitcairn appeared, waving his sword, shouting that the day was won. At that moment, an African-American soldier stepped forward and fired. Pitcairn fell. Samuel Swett, who chronicled the battle in 1818, wrote that a black soldier named Salem shot Pitcairn through, and he fell. An eyewitness account described it this way: "The British Major Pitcairn had passed the storm of our fire and had mounted the redoubt. When waving his sword, he commanded in a loud voice, 'The rebels to surrender.' His sudden appearance and his commanding air at first startled the men immediately below him. They neither answered nor fired, probably not being exactly certain what was to be done. At this critical moment, a Negro soldier stepped forward and, aiming his musket at the major's bosom, blew him through. British accounts tell a slightly different story. Lieutenant John Waller, writing just 4 days after the battle, described Pitcairn being hit before he even reached the fortifications. Shot while his Marines received very heavy and severe fire from the enemy for 10 minutes or a near quarter hour. Multiple British sources say Pitcairn was shot 4 times by different shooters. It's entirely possible that both versions are partially true. In the chaos of battle, with hundreds of men firing at once, Pitcairn may have been hit multiple times as he led his Marines up the hill and over the defenses. What we know for certain is this: Major John Pitcairn fell into the arms of his son Thomas, also a Marine officer, who cried out, "I have lost my father." Other Marines wept openly. Pitcairn was carried back to Boston, where General Gage sent his personal physician to treat him. When the doctor removed Pitcairn's coat, he bled profusely. He died within hours. After the battle, several Marines said they had all lost a father. He was buried at the Old North Church in Boston, the same church where he had worshipped on Sundays. His death sent shock waves through both armies. The Americans lost the Battle of Bunker Hill. They were driven from their positions when they ran out of ammunition. But it was a Pyrrhic victory for the British. They suffered over 1,000 casualties, including 282 dead. The Americans lost less than half that number. More importantly, the battle proved that colonial militia could stand and fight against regular troops. One British officer wrote of his commanders in Boston, "They expected rather to punish a mob than fight with troops that would look them in the face." The British abandoned plans for further frontal assaults against well-defended positions. General Henry Clinton called it a dear-bought victory, and the death of Major Pitcairn, widely reported in colonial newspapers, became a rallying point for American morale. Peter Salem emerged from the battle with a growing reputation. His fellow soldiers took up a collection for him. He was presented to General George Washington as the man who killed Pitcairn. Whether he fired the fatal shot or was one of several men who hit Pitcairn, the legend took hold. In 1786, artist John Trumbull painted his famous depiction of the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he included an African-American soldier believed to be Peter Salem, standing behind a white officer with a musket. That painting hangs today in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. But here's where we need to complicate the story. There was another African-American soldier named Salem at Bunker Hill. Salem Poor, from Andover, had bought his own freedom and enlisted in the militia. Poor distinguished himself so remarkably that on December 5, 1775, 13 Continental Army officers, including the battle's American commander William Prescott, sent a petition to the Massachusetts General Court. It praised Salem Poor in extraordinary terms, comparing him to an experienced officer. The petition is remarkable because white gentlemen in 1775 simply did not write such things about black men. Whatever Salem Poor did at Bunker Hill, it was exceptional. Over time, the identities of Peter Salem and Salem Poor may have merged in popular memory. The historical record is unclear about exactly who did what on that bloody hill. What matters is that both men were there. Both fought bravely. Both earned the respect of their fellow soldiers. And both were part of the 5,000 to 8,000 African Americans who served in the Revolutionary War. After Bunker Hill, Peter Salem continued to serve. In late 1775, General Washington initially banned African Americans from enlisting. Washington, a Virginia slave owner himself, understood the fears of Southern colonists who worried about arming enslaved people. He also understood the need for a continental force that could unite soldiers from different regions. But Washington was also desperate for men. The Continental Army was struggling to fill its ranks. When Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, promised freedom to any enslaved people who joined the British side, Washington quickly reversed his decision. Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment, composed of escaped slaves, represented both a military threat and a propaganda disaster. If the British were offering freedom to black soldiers, the Americans needed to compete. On December 30th, 1775, Washington issued a new order permitting free African Americans to serve. The Continental Congress approved this on January 16, 1776. Salem re-enlisted on January 1, 1776, joining the 4th Continental Regiment for a one-year term. He served under General Nathaniel Greene and took part in the New York campaign. He fought at the Battle of Harlem Heights in September 1776 and at Trenton in December, the famous Christmas crossing of the Delaware. A year later, on January 1, 1777, Salem re-enlisted again, this time for 3 years. This 3-year term took him to some of the war's most important battles. He was at Saratoga in September and October 1777, where American forces defeated British General John Burgoyne and forced his surrender. Burgoyne left the British camp, and his troops piled their arms on the side of the Hudson River on October 17th. Historians consider Saratoga the turning point of the Revolutionary War, the battle that convinced France to enter the war on the American side. Peter Salem was there for it. He spent the winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge, enduring the brutal cold and near starvation that tested the Continental Army to its breaking point. Many soldiers were without shoes and blankets. They were suffering from exposure, typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia. They were dying, and they were deserting, and Washington had no way to replace them. States weren't meeting their militia quotas. It was during this desperate time that the Continental Army most heavily relied on black soldiers who enlisted for longer terms than white soldiers typically did. Salem fought at Monmouth in June 1778, another brutal engagement in the New Jersey heat, and he was at Stony Point in July 1779, a midnight assault on a British garrison on the Hudson River that became one of the war's most daring operations. Through all of this, Salem served in Colonel Thomas Nixon's 6th Massachusetts Regiment. One account says that for part of this time, he served as the colonel's body servant, though he always spoke of Nixon in terms of admiration. He appears on muster rolls and payrolls throughout 1779. On December 31, 1779, he was honorably discharged. But he wasn't done yet. In January 1780, he enlisted one more time, serving until March 1, 1780. In total, Peter Salem served in the Continental Army for nearly 5 years. When he finally left military service in March 1780, Salem was a free man. The war was still going on. It wouldn't end until 1783. But Salem's fighting days were over. He returned to Massachusetts and settled in the town of Salem, perhaps drawn by the name that had been given to him by his first owner. In September 1783, he married a woman named Katie Benson. The couple built a cabin near Leicester, Massachusetts, in the rural countryside. Salem tried to make a living as a cane weaver, creating the woven seats for chairs. It was skilled work, but it didn't pay well. He supplemented his income by gardening, making baskets, and repairing furniture. He never prospered. By the time of the 1790 census, his marriage to Katie had been dissolved. They had no children. Salem was listed in the census as living alone in his cabin near Leicester. The site of that cabin, on a southeast-facing hillside just off what is now Peter Salem Road, was discovered in the early 1900s when a well was found on the property. He lived in his cabin for years, barely scraping by. He became known as a storyteller. Children and adults would come to hear his stories about the war, about standing on Breed's Hill, about the smoke and the noise and the British Marines charging up with their bayonets, about the winter at Valley Forge where men died from cold and hunger, about Saratoga where Burgoyne surrendered and the Americans proved they could win a major battle, about Monmouth and Stony Point. He kept these memories alive, sharing them with whoever would listen, but they didn't put food on his table. The United States had no pension system for Revolutionary War veterans during Salem's lifetime. Congress didn't pass a pension law for veterans who hadn't been disabled until 1818, 2 years after Salem died. Even if he'd lived to see it, the law was amended in 1820 and 1822 when the number of applicants exceeded expectations, and the young nation couldn't afford to pay them all. Some black veterans who did live long enough to apply for pensions faced discrimination, with payments denied or delayed based on their race. Peter Salem received no compensation for his 5 years of military service. No recognition, no support, no reward for standing at Bunker Hill or surviving Valley Forge. The African-American patriots who served the Continental Army found that the post-war military held few rewards for them. While soldiers of African descent had received the same pay as white soldiers during the war, at least in theory, the reality after the war was starkly different. Many ended up extremely poor. Prejudice and discrimination made it difficult for them to find work. And while all states north of Maryland gradually abolished slavery by the early 1800s, creating new generations born into freedom, the institution greatly expanded in the southern states in the decades leading up to the Civil War. As Salem aged, his situation grew desperate. He couldn't work as effectively. The money ran out. His former masters, Lawson Buckminster and Jeremiah Belknap, the men who had owned him, gave money to the town to support him. Think about that for a moment. The men who had once held him as property, who had bought and sold him like livestock, now contributed to his care in old age. Was it guilt, obligation, some vestige of paternalistic responsibility? We don't know. What we know is that it wasn't enough. Eventually, the town officials in Leicester sent Salem back to Framingham. He ended up in the poorhouse, a government-run facility for the destitute and dependent. This is where Peter Salem, veteran of Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, Harlem Heights, Trenton, Saratoga, Valley Forge, Monmouth, and Stony Point, spent his final days. This is where the man who had stood against the British Empire, who had fought for American independence, who had earned the respect of George Washington himself, died in poverty. On August 16, 1816, at the age of 65 or 66, Peter Salem died in the Framingham poorhouse. He was buried in a pauper's grave at the old burying ground in Framingham. His grave wasn't even marked. For 66 years, he lay in an unmarked grave in the cemetery in the town where he was born. The historical record notes that even in the poorhouse, he was not treated entirely like the common poor. To the credit of his former masters, Buckminster and Belknap, along with Samuel Hemingway, had given a bond to the town to support him during his natural life. It was a gesture, but a hollow one for a man who had given so much. But Framingham didn't forget him. In 1882, 66 years after his death, the town spent $150 to fill and grade the grave site, which was in a low part of the cemetery, and erect a granite monument. The inscription reads, "Peter Salem, a soldier of the Revolution. Concord, Bunker Hill, Saratoga, died August 16, 1816. Erected by the town, 1882. That same year, Framingham established an annual Peter Salem Day on June 17th, the anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill. In 1909, the Daughters of the American Revolution placed a stone on the grounds where Salem's cabin had stood in Leicester. It reads, "Here lived Peter Salem, a Negro soldier of the Revolution." In 1968, the U.S. Postal Service issued a stamp honoring John Trumbull's painting of Bunker Hill, which features the figure believed to be Peter Salem. For many years, the Freedmen's Bank of Boston commemorated Salem's deeds by printing his picture on their banknotes. Peter Salem's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the American Revolution. This was a war fought in the name of liberty, a war whose founding document declared that all men are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights. But the men who wrote those words owned slaves. The army that fought for independence included thousands of black soldiers who returned after the war to continued oppression and inequality. Peter Salem fought for a country that considered him property. Many white colonists, both slave owners and others, feared an uprising if enslaved people were armed with weapons. Many would have protested having to serve alongside men of color as equals. These fears shaped military policy throughout the war. His military service didn't earn him respect in civilian life. It didn't earn him security. It didn't earn him a pension or even basic recognition while he was alive. When he was useful, when the Continental Army needed men, his freedom was granted. When the war ended and he was no longer needed, he was left to fend for himself. He spent his final years in poverty and died in a poorhouse. The new Congress passed laws forbidding black people to serve in the military after the Revolution. By the time pensions were offered to Revolutionary War veterans, most black heroes were already dead. But here's what his story also tells us. African Americans fought for independence from the very beginning. They were at Lexington and Concord. They were at Bunker Hill. They were at Saratoga and Valley Forge and Monmouth. About 1/5 of the men in the Northern Continental Army were black. At the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, a German officer estimated about 1/4 of the American army to be black men. They didn't wait to be given their rights. They fought for them. They put their lives on the line for a promise of freedom that America would take nearly another century to even begin to fulfill. Peter Salem and the thousands of other black soldiers who served in the Revolutionary War did so, knowing that their service might not bring them freedom. Salem, poor, performed so heroically that 14 officers felt compelled to document his bravery. Cuff Whittenmore was cited for fighting bravely and allowed to keep a sword he captured from a British officer. Crispus Attucks, who was killed in the Boston Massacre in 1770, became the first martyr of the Revolution. These men did it anyway. They fought alongside white soldiers who would return to communities that still practiced slavery. They took orders from officers who owned slaves. They risked everything for a revolution that would not revolutionize their own status. And yet, their service mattered. The fact that black soldiers fought bravely and effectively at Bunker Hill, that they were praised by white officers as the equals of experienced soldiers, that generals like Washington came to rely on them, all of this chipped away at the ideological foundations of slavery. If black men could fight and die for American independence, how could anyone justify keeping them enslaved? The contradiction was glaring. It would take time for that contradiction to be resolved, but the service of men like Peter Salem made it impossible to ignore. The American Revolution didn't end slavery. It would take another war, the Civil War, and nearly 90 more years before the 13th Amendment finally abolished it. But the Revolutionary War did plant seeds. It created a language of liberty and equality that, however hypocritical its initial application, could eventually be wielded by those fighting for true freedom. When Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists argued against slavery, they invoked the principles of the Declaration of Independence. When civil rights activists marched for equality, they carried those same principles with them. The words, "all men are created equal," didn't include black Americans in 1776, but black soldiers like Peter Salem had fought to make those words mean something. Peter Salem's grave in Framingham is isolated from the others in the cemetery. Even in death, even when the town honored him with a monument, he was set apart. His gravesite's isolation is a reminder that even as America recognized his service, it still couldn't fully embrace him as an equal. The monument came 66 years too late to help him. The recognition came when he could no longer benefit from it. The annual Peter Salem Day that Framingham established celebrated him after he died in their poorhouse. But the monument stands. The stone in Leicester stands. His name endures. Not because Peter Salem got rich or famous in his lifetime, not because America treated him well, but because his story and the stories of thousands of other black soldiers like him reveal something essential about American history. The fight for American independence and the fight for black freedom are not separate stories. They're the same story, told from different perspectives. They're intertwined, inseparable, each one incomplete without the other. Only 50 years after the defeat of the British at Yorktown, most Americans had already forgotten the extensive role black people had played on both sides during the War for Independence. At the 1876 centennial celebration of the Revolution in Philadelphia, there was zero mention of the contributions of African Americans in the fight for independence. It took conscious effort by historians and activists to recover these stories, to restore these names to the historical record. Every battle for American freedom, from the Revolution to the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and beyond, has included black Americans fighting for a promise that America has been slow to keep. Peter Salem was born into slavery on October 1st, 1750. He died in poverty on August 16, 1816. In between, he fought in some of the most important battles of the American Revolution. He stood his ground when the British Empire came charging up Breed's Hill. He survived Valley Forge. He was part of the Continental Army that won American independence. He served for nearly 5 years while white soldiers enlisted for shorter periods. He was there at the beginning at Lexington and Concord, and he was there through the crucial middle years at Saratoga and Monmouth. His story is American history, not a footnote, not a sidebar, not an interesting addition to the main narrative. His story is the main narrative. Because America was built by people like Peter Salem, people whose labor and sacrifice and courage made the country possible, even when the country refused to recognize their full humanity. Their contributions can't be erased by their exclusion from history books or by their burial in isolated corners of cemeteries. The monument in Framingham stands as a reminder, not just of Peter Salem's military service, though that matters, but of a larger truth. Every battle for American freedom, from the Revolution to the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and beyond, has included Black Americans fighting for a promise that America has been slow to keep. Peter Salem died in a poorhouse, but his legacy endures. He fought for a country that didn't fully belong to him, in hopes that one day it would. That fight continues. And it continues because men like Peter Salem proved, with their blood and their service and their sacrifice, that the promise of American freedom belongs to everyone, regardless of what the laws said in 1775 or 1816 or any other year. They claimed that promise with their lives. They made it real with their courage. And they left us with an obligation to finally, fully, make good on what they fought for.